Sandhan. All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Vande Gujarat.
Hello students, this time I'm back with gynocentrism. Before we begin to understand in detail what exactly is gynocentrism, we need to first split up the term in order to understand the concept. Gyno is related with the term female and centrism is associated with the concept of focusing. Therefore, when we combine the two terms gynocentrism, it means that it is focusing on women. Listen to me very carefully when I will repeat the words of Peter Wright. Peter Wright says, gynocentrism refers to a dominant or exclusive focus on women in theory or practice, or to the advocacy of this. Meaning, when we are focusing on the development of women, or when we are questioning about their oppression, when we are dealing with the whole idea centered on women, we call it gynocentrism. The term gynocentrism has been in circulation since 1800s, with the general definition, as Peter Wright says, being focused on women and concerned only with female. In his book, Gynocentrism, From Feudalism to the Modern Disney Pictures, Peter Wright says that elements of gynocentric culture that exist today are derived from practices that originate in medieval society, such as feudalism, chivalry, and courtly love. So gynocentrism, as we see it today, might exist today as a structure as it is, as a concept as it is, but then its roots lie deep in the medieval culture, in the medieval European culture, especially feudalism. When we are talking about feudalism, we are not just talking about land and land ownership and the loyalty of the feudator to the landowner, but we are talking here of something different. When we talk about feudalism, chivalry, and courtly love that continues to inform even the contemporary society in subtle ways about gynocentrism, Peter Wright is referring to those patterns of gynocentrism as that which constitute sexual feudalism attested by female writers such as Lucrezia Marinella and, of course, the others as well. Lucrezia Marinella in 1600 AD, as we know, recounted, or let's say described, that women of lower socio-economic classes were treated as superiors by men who acted as servants. Now, when you listen to that statement, that even the women of lower socio-economic status were considered superior to men, then in what sense? If they were lower from the socioeconomic point of view, from what point of view could they be considered as superior to men? Well, that was moral point of view. They were considered morally cut above men. Now we need to understand sexual feudalism in context of gynocentrism, because otherwise we will not be able to understand, number one, why women were considered morally cut above men in spite of being lower to them, subordinate to them as far as their socioeconomic status is concerned. And how is sexual feudalism in any way concerned or connected with gynocentrism? As Peter Wright says again, the gynocentric customs guiding relationships between the male and the female originate in old Europe in the form of damseling, chivalry, and courtly love. I have already mentioned this, that Peter Wright constantly focuses on the one fact that the gynocentrism that we see today has its roots deep in the tradition of damseling, chivalry, courtly love that existed in medieval Europe, in old Europe. The tradition began in 12th century France and Germany, and that spread rapidly to all the principal courts of Europe. From there, it filtered into popular culture, being transported eventually to the New World. Now, what was this New World? New World was the America, India, Australia, and so on and so forth. So you can see very clearly that it began in 12th century in France and Germany, and then it quickly spread across Europe. And not only just that, but it also spread to the colonies of Europe, the colonies established by Europeans, whether it be America or India or Australia. When we are talking about the New World and when we are talking about sexual feudalism in this context, we need to know that in the medieval model, in the medieval society, or rather the model of that society, men offered themselves as vassals. We will talk about the term, we'll concentrate upon that term. So please listen very carefully that as far as the medieval structure of society is concerned, men were considered as vassals. And vassals to women who took the status of overlords. This is because women were widely viewed as superior to male. Now, why is this so? Who, number one, is the vassal? Vassal is a feudatory. He is a person who is considered in mutual obligation to the lord or the monarch, and therefore he needs to be loyal. If you are a feudatory, if you are a vassal, definitely you are subordinate to your lord, and therefore, though you are in mutual obligation, you get the privileges in exchange of the services that you provide. And therefore, you need to go back to what Modesta Pozzo says. Modesta Pozzo has also pointed this out, that men, labor all day out and bring in the wealth. So they are the source of wealth. And we are there at home, waiting to enjoy the privileges that the wealth brings to them. Now, this wealth is, of course, brought by the hard labor of men. So that's what she's pointing about. Now, we need to move on to the point that this was expounded by first troubadours. Troubadours are the storytellers, in the form of a ballad, who move from one court to another, from one place to another. Troubadours are the people who narrate the story in the lyrical fashion, like ballads, and they move from one court to another, from one place to another. And they explained that men pledged homage and fealty to women, who actively played the part of man's superior. Now, when you say fealty and homage, what exactly do you mean? Like I said, fealty is not just loyalty. Fealty is the feudator's loyalty to his monarch, to his lord. Now, this Peter Wright says is the sexual feudalistic formula, and this in its entirety he calls as gynocentric culture. Now, we need to move on to the next person who has talked about gynocentrism in a little different way. Her name is Linda J. Nicholson. Linda Nicholson, in her book, The Second Wave, a reader into feminism, or a reader in feminist theory, volume 1, says that chapter 3 should be labeled, or rather she has labeled her chapter 3 as gynocentrism, that covers the scope of women's oppression, women's identity, and women's standpoint. Now, in this chapter, Nicholson states that in the early 1970s, second wave feminists began to focus more extensively than previously on the differences between men and women. So before 1970s, there was more focus on the other things, right, rather than the differences between men and women. It was not that the differences were ignored, that they were not acknowledged. They were, of course, but the emphasis was given more in, or rather from, 1970s, during 1970s especially. Now, why so? This is because a focus on the differences, she says, between men and women was a crucial element of the radical feminism. at the late 1960s. So radical feminism began in the late 1960s, and that focused more on the differences between men and women. In many respects, in many aspects, in many areas, the differences, or gynocentric feminism, that began to emerge in the early 1970s can be seen, Nicholson says, as the logical extension, I repeat, Linda Nicholson says that gynocentric feminism of the 1970s can be seen as a logical extension to the growing recognition by many feminists of the importance of gender as an organizing principle of Indian individual identity and social organization. Now, what does the statement mean? There is no need to get scared of the statement when you listen to that. Well, what Nicholson is trying to say that before 1970s, women did not think of gender as an important role that shapes their individualistic identity, that gender could play such a role, that gender could be a foundation stone or an organizing principle, as Nicholson states, of the individualistic identity and social organization. Now, why does she say that? As Simone de Beauvoir has said, that one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman. So how does she become a woman? That is because of the conditioning that she gets while she is nurtured up like a woman. So if an individual is born biologically as a female, she is taught to play with feminine toys. She is taught to play with dolls. She is taught to control her anger. Well, controlling an anger applies to both the genders, to both male and female, but she is supposed to be sweet-tempered. So, femininity that is closely associated with the females gives rise to the womanhood. So one is not born a woman, one is made to feel a woman. And once you say that one is made to feel a woman, or one becomes a woman over a period of time, you are made to feel weak and a part of society that needs support. Now, why so? And what does Nicholson think about it? Let's move on. A focus on the differences between men and women, combined with the radical feminist sense of the magnitude of women's oppression, led first to an elaboration of women's mind as deeply shaped by the experience of oppression. I repeat, that a focus on the differences between men and women, combined with the radical feminist sense of the magnitude of women's oppression, led first to an elaboration of women's minds as deeply shaped by the experience of oppression. So the focus on the difference that comes from the radical feminist point of view, and that talks about the magnitude or the amount of, oppression, female oppression. And therefore, when you are talking about gynocentric writings, you are talking about analyzing a particular work, or writing a particular work that focuses on female oppression, that focuses on the experiences that are colored by female oppression. Now, we move on to what the other writers argue about. The writers argued that women are socialized to internalize a conception of themselves as lesser things or lesser beings. Now, why so? Like I said, you are conditioned in such a way that you are not made to realize that you are capable and that you have a strength to do certain things. The society trains you to think that you are not capable of this. And that is not true. Even the mere physical capacity. Now, why is it stated that we cannot lift, perhaps a wooden table? Well, we can. Some of us can, at least. But then, the very, internalization process that has been into existence right from your birth makes you believe that you cannot do it. And therefore, even though you are physically capable to do it, your attitude or your internalization, your conditioning prevents you from doing it. This is exactly like the little story that we know that, there was a little nest of the eagles, and the egg of the eagle falls down and it cracks amidst, the company of hen, and therefore the eagle starts believing that he or she is a hen. Therefore, when the bird internalizes itself as a hen and looks at the sky, it imagines that when can it fly, or why it cannot fly like the other eagles. But the truth is, the bird is an eagle. It's just that because it's been, amongst the company of the hen for a very long time, it has started believing that it too is a hen. It's the same way. It's the same way. We cannot believe that we can push the envelope because we are not taught to believe that. And we take it and we, just are subservient to it. We take it. We accept that we cannot do that. And that is the reason we start feeling that we are weak, that we start feeling that this is what our position, our status is. Right. So now we move on to the point of a journal called Feminist Thought that was published by MIT in the fall of 2014, and the writer of this essay is Iris Young, and she has written the essay called From Humanism to Gynocentrism. So what's the difference between a humanist feminism and a gynocentric feminism? Let's see into the detail. As mentioned in the essay, humanist feminism is a revolt against femininity. Women's confinement to femininity stunts, Young says, the development of their full potential and makes women passive, dependent, and weak. According to Iris Young, humanist feminism seeks to remove legal and institutional barriers to women's development and opportunities. Humanist feminism seeks to provide resources to combat past discriminations. It sees justice in terms of fairness. And humanist feminism